Okay, welcome everybody to this Independent Socialists in Wellingborough meeting on Thursday, the 28th of September 2023. We have a guest speaker this evening who's actually not really a guest because he's a member of ISW and has been since it was formed many years ago. And that's why he looks old. And so Wilkie Wilkinson, Wilkie's now a retired social worker, but still very active, and he was also a Unison shop steward and activist for many years, and specialised in working with young people. I think Wilkie, you may say more about what your job involved, and hence issues around homelessness and benefits and what have you has been a key component of your professional life. But now you can retire. Now you retire. Perhaps you want to say something more of a political nature about homelessness, particularly amongst young people. But anyway, Wilkie, over to you. So it's this evening's talks on homelessness and benefits.
Okay. Thank you. For those that don't know, I spent the last 20 years or so dealing with homeless young people and their families. I was plenty political enough when I was doing it, to be honest. Certain managers would have felt their ears quite red at times about some things they were suggesting. Just if we was Houses of Parliament, Sue would have to declare an interest here. Of course, she did work on the Supporting Housing project for a while. The Supporting People, it was called. It's illustrative of what happens with housing, really. The monies that scheme had to fund people living in semi-independent accommodation, getting support to get themselves out of bad situations into better ones. The government stopped that. They gave the money to the county council to distribute it instead. And as you can imagine, everything came to a grinding halt and the council went bankrupt. So it didn't help any. Basically, just what I wanted to talk about was a little bit about, we talk about homeless, so I just thought I'd give the legal definition. And when you hear the legal definition, you'll understand why there's a completely different system, sometimes for refugees and asylum seekers. And it might be best to have Angela to come talk and share her experience about that matter. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the benefit system and how that interlaces with housing. I think that will be useful because I think we're all fed up with people saying that people are sat on their arse at home, getting the houses paid. You know, people come over here and in 5 minutes they've got rehoused and they're giving them massive grants and all this sort of stuff. It just simply isn't true. And one thing that lies like is actual truth, not my truth, your truth, but the facts. So basically, just a little bit about homelessness legislation is really quite good to work with because it's actually it's got tests in law. So if somebody was to present from homeless, the homelessness officer would apply these 5 tests in the first case. 1, is this person a British citizen, and are they eligible for public services? Now, this may apply to some people because you do also have people living here quite legally, but they're on sponsorships, which means that they have no recourse to public funds. So that would see them drop out straight away. Second one, are they homeless? The definition of somebody being homeless is that there's no accommodation that they have a right to occupy. Young people living at home up until they achieve adulthood at 18 are assumed to have a bare license to live at home. And I've had many an argument with housing departments about when a family kicks a young person out, is it because they've disobeyed the rules, or is it because they've had a relationship breakdown with their family? And often that would, I'll go into that a little bit later. So that's the second test. Are you actually homeless? Do you have anywhere you have a right to occupy? Or you have a right to occupy but can't access it. So that might be something like an illegal landlord locking you out of the property, somebody towing your caravan away, somebody sinking your canal boat. The third test is if you are homeless, are you intentionally homeless or not? To be intentionally homeless means that you failed to do something, like pay the rent, or you've done something deliberately or with full knowledge, such as smashing up your neighbour's house if you live in social housing, that would stop you being able to occupy that property usually. So if you're intentionally homeless, there are services they offer you, but they don't own what they call the main statutory duty to you. The next question they ask is, do you have a local connection? I.e., have you lived in the borough, etc. And each different, in Northamptonshire, there'll be 2 criteria now, but before unitary, there'll be 7 different criteria for the 7 different district and borough councils. So you could have fun sorting that out from one to another. And then the next, if you pass all those tests, the next one to see if the housing department will actually assist you there and then is, are you in a priority group? A priority group really meaning somebody who's, generally speaking, means you would find it more difficult to find your own accommodation than somebody else. People who be in priority groups would be people like the disabled, vulnerable adults, people with children, that sort of group, people who would find it more difficult than the average citizen to do so. So if the council do find they've got a duty to you, they then should offer you temporary accommodation for 28 days while they assess your claim and apply those 5 tests and see if they've got a main duty to you. Now, the good bit about housing legislation is you will get a letter explaining whether you have passed those tests or not, and you can appeal it. And if you're in temporary accommodation for those 28 days, then yes, they should keep you in that temporary accommodation while they process your application. Where people often make a mistake is people have walked into different district councils offices before, said I'm homeless, I wish to apply for housing, and often they don't get past the front door because they get sent away with a bit of paper saying, here's an application form, do it online, please fill in to apply for the housing register. That's something completely separate. Then not by law, it is illegal to refuse a homelessness application. If you don't know all the legislation, it's just called a Part 7 application and they're supposed to do that. You don't have to be there in person. You can do it by any communication means you want. We will find as we go along that with the increasing pressure on housing departments, they're very, very aggressively gatekeeping. So they will try and put you off making an application at first. Even so, if you're homeless, and remember, that's the definition of somewhere you have no right to occupy, you can apply as homeless if you're staying on somebody's sofa, if you're occupying a spare room with a friend or a friend's family or whatever. And you can, what they call technically, be called homeless at home. That means you don't have to accept any temporary accommodation, but you can still process your application by staying at a friend's. Often, people are aware of this. They'll say, I'm staying with a friend for a while, and they'll say, well, come back when you're street homeless. I think the other thing that people have experience of is where people have been given a legal notice to quit, and they go to the council saying, look, the landlord, I've been with them for 5 years, they've been very good, he's going to sell the property, he's given me notice to quit, I've got to be out by Christmas. Often what people will find, what housing will do now, is insist that you stay in place where you are until the landlord's actually gone to court and got the full legal sort of paraphernalia to get you evicted. That will often take you by past your quit date. That's very traumatic for people to live through that. People do feel very bad about it because often sometimes they've had a reasonable landlord and it seems a reasonable request and they're just not able to find anywhere else. And when we look at the benefits in a minute, we might find why they find that difficult. So that's basically housing law. As you said, by that first test of you a British citizen or reply to public services, that takes you into the asylum seekers groups, etc., and the refugee things. If you are successful, they should give you housing, temporary housing if you've got nowhere to go. And then you apply through the housing register. We'll come to some facts and figures about that later on. For people who don't know, fortunately haven't been in that situation for the moment, they've moved to a situation called choice-based lettings. It used to be very much once upon a time that people's name would be put on the list and their name would percolate to the top and then the council offer them a property. Now, everybody, if they're accepted on the housing list, and again, there's qualifications for that. Each council has a different rule about residence, income. Some will say you're earning too much, we can't assist you, etc. They have a thing called choice-based lettings. So not only do you go on the list, and it's not by date order anymore, they give you a degree of priority. And people that are on the homelessness list should be usually put into the top category, which was A. Unfortunately, with the pressure that's been on housing so much, because we've got so little housing, which we may want to talk about later, and largely stems, in my experience, from the sell-off of council houses and refusing to use receipts to be able to build new houses. Thatcher, thank you. They've now found it necessary to actually put different bands within the A top priority band. So you now get A star plus, etc. That still sounds as if it's, however that said, there's still no guarantee of people getting houses. I've had a single father when I left who was on the settee with his 7-year-old boy at his grand's warden-controlled flat, waiting to be rehoused for 18 months when I left work, and he still hadn't been rehoused. So it is a really awful situation. The housing department, people assume that if they found you homeless and they find you in priority need of accommodation, that they will house you somewhere permanently. That's no longer the case. The laws were changed so that they could actually find you a private rent, and it was assumed that they would find you a private rent for up to 2 years, which is the period of time they have the main duty to you if they have found you have passed those 5 tests. Nowadays, they can find you a tenancy for as little as 6 months and then work on it to get you over up to the 2 years at a later time. The council housing departments now, not many of them have their own stock. Often, like in Wellingborough, our housing stock gets sent off to Wellingborough Homes. And the further you get away from the bit they were floated off, the further away you get from any degree, I think, of social responsibility. There's no political control, and they do run sometimes as a business. They do have parts that they can assist with, and they do like to be seen to work in partnership, but at the end of the day, we have to accept that they're a different sort of socially minded landlord rather than being social stock, as used to happen under Corby Council, and Kettering Council used to keep their own stock as well. Great Wall Homes, it's called now. Yeah, so this is perhaps where I want to talk about benefits, then we'll see how people are when they find out in that situation. I worked with young people, and that was a particular bugbear. Sue will know this. At one time, we had projects in every town, in every area, for young people who couldn't live at home anymore, where they got support and encouragement to be, to manage to look after themselves, to find work, to manage the budget, and do everything else that they wanted to do. They've all disappeared. They've gone, absolutely gone. So in my experience, I think we used to have about 80 different places around the county we could place young people under the age of 18 for supported accommodation. They've all disappeared now. Young people are forced to go to housing and social services. There was law codifying it because social services had duties to these young people, 16 to 18, who had nowhere to go. Housing also had duties for 17 and 18-year-olds who had nowhere to go. And it's ended up in a massive situation where young people who are homeless, chucked out of home, go to one, and they're told it's the responsibility of the other one. And they get into this revolving door situation where they're forever rattling between social services and housing departments. As part of the aggressive gatekeeping at both housing and social services, young people now are expected to live in the most awful situations. And, it's very lucky for all young person to actually be accepted into care or provided for by social services. What we have found is that for those young people, 16, 17, that social services do pick up, they tend not to take into care, but they just offer them something called Section 17, which is voluntary assistance, which means that when they're 18, they get put back on the street. So they've just warehoused them for a couple of years. They don't want to take young people into care because they then have a duty to the age of 21. And when you're a care leaver, you're also a priority case to the housing department. So if social services don't take the young people into care but offer them voluntary assistance, it's sale and no return. They just voted out the door at 18 and they're back on the streets. And I've seen an awful lot of that, and that's a real shame. Now, if we talk a little bit how benefits fit in with the housing department, I'm sure it's a lot of information. I'm quite happy to have any questions or anything that comes up later. In terms of benefits, again, a particular bugbear for me, young people are incredibly discriminated against. You don't get your full level of universal credit, job seekers allowance or whatever until you're 25. So if you're under 25, you get, I think it's gone up recently to about £63 a week. If you're over 25, you get your £83 a week. There's usually about £20 difference between the two, which is astonishing to me because the cost difference is absolutely no different if you're under 25. You can't walk into the chip shop and say, I'm under 25, can you knock a quid off that bag of chips, please? They'll just laugh at you. You know what I mean? So it's exactly the same. So they're discriminated in that way. In terms of accommodation and what would be available to you, ignore the council at the moment, just any housing, private housing. If you're unless you're in social housing, if you're under the age of 35, you're expected to only rent a room in a shared house. So you can imagine by the age of 35, there's lots of people with relationship breakups, and we'll come to see a bit later the main cause of homeless applications to the councils is relationship breakup. The second cause is private landlords giving notice to quit. So they're the main categories. Yeah, so if you're 35 and you're not working and you need help with your rent, you're only allowed a room in a shared house. And many people find that absolutely impossible to maintain some sort of family situation, even if they're in a shared house and the children are able to come visit them perhaps and stay in their room. Nobody else in the house is police checked. You've no idea who else you're giving access to your children because you will be in shared amenities. You will be sharing a bathroom, you will be sharing a kitchen, you will be sharing a living room. So that's quite a worry. In terms of local housing allowance, which used to be known as housing benefit, which was that part of the benefit that helped you with your rent. If nowadays, with the move to universal credit, that's often paid as part of your universal credit rather than a separate payment. So that can create difficulties for people with budgeting issues. When they look at what you can have, local housing allowance rates, as was, used to be fixed into the middle percentile of the local rental market. So if you had a house from costing nothing a week to a house costing £100 a week, you could expect to be able to claim for rent sort of £40 to £60 a week, somewhere in the middle of the market. That's now been fixed at the bottom 20%. So straight away, 8 out of 10 houses you can't even look at because you can't afford them. However, there is so little out there. People are renting those houses and having to make the money up out of their own benefits. That's particularly difficult as well for obviously for young people, because if you're under 25, you've got £17 a week less to live on. This makes it very difficult for young people. So most landlords, if they look at taking somebody on benefits, and a lot won't, and I'll come back to that in a moment, you don't have to be a gambling person to realise if you've got to collect £10 or £15 a week off your rent from somebody on £85 a week or somebody on £63 a week, you're going to get it more likely off the person who's got more coming in. And so that does make it very difficult for those under 25. The reason I mention all this is sometimes it does cross my mind very much where all these young people that we used to assist go to when there's no supported housing available for them there. At the same time as we've got rid of all the youth service, so we've got nobody intervening with these young people, and at the same time we've seen a massive rise in the false family idea of the gang. Somebody that will look after you, somebody that will put money in your pocket, somebody that will give a roof over your head, make you feel as if you're worth something. And I think I think those two are connected in one way or another. Yeah, so that, in terms of benefits, it becomes very difficult. Most councils actually know that there's no private rented accommodation in their area that they can actually refer somebody to and technically know that they'll be able to afford it. They all know that people will be paying rent now. And we have to remember at that, when people are fixed on their benefit rates, that is the lowest level that people are deemed to be able to live on. And the rent is paid separately. So we are asking people to dig into, and with the cost of living crisis, with no money about at all, your very essential elements are at risk. Do you pay the rent, or pay the gas and electricity, or buy the kids' school clothes? Very hard decisions, with risk in all of them. So that's basically how they all tie up, really. And yeah, I mean, why is there less housing? Well, I think we've actually said the first thing there is really the Thatcher sell-off of the council houses, which isn't an issue in itself. It's the not being allowed to use the deposits to actually build new properties. I think it's because with austerity and all the other government policies where we used to insist on social housing in private developers, that's largely gone out of the way now. There is a few, but not many. And on small developments of less than sort of 20 houses and that, often they're allowed to give a sum to the council in lieu of actually putting social housing in those new developments. So I think that's seriously been an issue as well. Rent controls would be a really good idea. I think leveling up the level of benefits, putting that back to that medium in the market, so people could actually be able to compete. Because you do end up with people moving into very, unless they're conscientious landlords, you do get exploitative landlords, and you do get people living in absolutely awful conditions. They can't make any complaints because they know there's nowhere else to go, or they know at the moment they could just be issued with a Section 121 no-fault notice, and they could be asked to leave. And there's numerous examples of people saying, my boiler doesn't work, and rather than fix it, within a month, the landlord's giving you notice to quit. So one of the other solutions to the matter is what's been adopted as the European model, is the idea to house first and ask questions later. We've always had a problem. So if somebody comes in with mental health problems, with drug problems, addiction problems, often they're asked to prove themselves, that they can stay calm, they can stay stable, they will cooperate with various different agencies. And if they pass those sort of things, then somebody will vouch for them, and then the council maybe look at housing them. The pandemic gave the lie to that sort of view. That was very much everybody out on the street, all the rough sleepers, they all came in and were offered accommodation straight away. And what was really interesting to see was the reports back from everybody involved in that, is how compliant these supposedly, rascal vagabonds were with all the requirements that were needed, kept the COVID rules, stayed in, engaged. Yep. And they were off the streets and they were housed, and you could do something constructive with people. Once the sort of COVID thing was over, then you start seeing people stepping up on the streets again. I noticed there was a paper released saying that there was 86 rough sleepers in the West Northampton area the other day. That's quite an underestimation in my point of view. We do have rough sleepers counts every couple of years to actually see how many people sleep in rough. You can't trust those figures. I've been out on them, Sue's probably been out on the counts. You have to actually find somebody on their bed, bedding down for the night, before we can count them as a rough sleeper. So if they're sat, 2 foot away from their actual sleeping bag or whatever, you can't count them. You're not allowed to go onto private land, which obviously where people go to hide away. Allotments, that sort of stuff, you're not allowed on them. So where people are likely to go and feel a little safe, you can't actually count them there. You're not allowed to enter any premises such as, squats, etc., which might be dangerous. So it's very limited what you can actually get. Those figures for the 86 in West North Hants, they was from something else, which is actually a very good thing. Something called SWEP, which is the Severe Weather Emergency Protocol. So that those people that wouldn't ordinarily be able to get assistance from the council are either homeless, but they're young, they're not entitled to British services, or they're intentionally homeless because they've had somewhere before and lost it, and so they're not eligible for help again. When the weather is going to be below zero for 3 nights running, all councils are obliged to offer accommodation to those people. And that gets used. So often then the figures who use the SWEP provision in severe weather are much higher than the Rough Sleepers count. And that's why. I think that figure would be higher if there wasn't a certain amount of deterrence built into that system. Because before, at one time, they may sort of offer people hotel rooms, which are warm, they can get a shower. Okay, it's only a microwave and a kettle, but at least they've got somewhere they can maybe eat stuff. But there's increasing use of going back to the bad old days of the Sally Army and dormitories, and they've only been opened at 10 at night, and you've got to believe at 8 in the morning, and you're in a row of beds in this church hall. No shouting, no swearing, no smoking, all sort of things that don't make it very attractive to some people. Yeah. So housing first is a good model, I think. We need to build more premises. We need to be. I've also got a personal thing about I hate going past and seeing these really nice Victorian and Georgian houses that have got firms of solicitors in them. There's loads and loads of places like that. Why can't they go out on the industrial estates into them soulless buildings and actually let people live in town centres in reasonable houses that were built for that purpose to live in? That's a bugbear for me. Wellingborough Council, as was actually one of the better ones. They were really good at prosecuting people whose houses were left vacant for long times. They were quite aggressive at chasing flats that hadn't been let above shops, for example. Very good at that sort of stuff. Compulsory purchase on abandoned buildings. So that was a good way to go as well. But overall, I mean, all I wanted to do there really was sort of say, you hear a lot of chat about the homeless. That's what the homeless are. If you get in the situation, that's what you've got to challenge. And, there's a bit of information there saying all these people sit at home, live in really nice houses. They don't. They live in the bottom 20% of the market if they can get that. Every council has a fund called discretionary housing payments, which they use when people turn up as housing. As homeless, they've accepted the duty to them. They might find them a private rent somewhere, but knowing if they're not working, and that might be very difficult for a single mum or dad with 3 kids under school age or one going to school, disabilities, whatever. So what they know they're not going to be able to cover the rent and universal credit. So for the period of that time, they've got the duty of the 2 years. They will make up the difference out of discretionary housing payments. It's a fixed sum every year, but it's there and it's available and people can ask for it sometimes. Sometimes if you go to the council and say, well, I've got rent arrears, the council are going to put me out, they'll actually pay the rent arrears off for you rather than actually deal with trying to find the impossible job of trying to find you somewhere else to go to. Yeah, so that's a happy little tale. Yeah. Is there anything I can sort of answer questions or enlighten Betty or observations? Anybody have? It's a whistle-stop tour for it, but
if you use if you wave, I can and unmute yourself. But it's better if you use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, because then you immediately can see. So if you raise your hand using the reaction button, then just as Andy Gunton's just done and Sue's just done, it's much easier for me to see who wants to speak. Okay, so Andy, you were first.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, right, just need to clarify or correct a few inaccuracies in Wilkie's interesting talk. Okay, so you don't have to be a British citizen in order to be eligible for assistance from a
No, you
housing
have to be
authority.
eligible for public funds.
You have to have access to public funds. Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. But you don't have to be a British citizen to have
No,
access to funds.
sorry, Andy, I did say British citizen or access to public funds.
Okay. Well, it's a bit of an interesting one because it's a very complex area of the law in relation to social housing. So, for example, people who are EU nationals, who are, if they have settled status, then they have access to public funds and they can access housing advice and assistance. If they have pre-settled status, they have to be working or have retained their worker status, or if they're temporarily unable to work but will be able to work at some point, they will retain their status, or they're self-employed. And if they don't meet those criteria, then they can't access public funds and they can't access social housing.
Yeah.
Anyone who's got indefinite leave to remain or limited leave to remain, as long as it provides access to public funds, can also approach the council if they're homeless. We do have issues with, for example, EU nationals who have significant mental health problems, are unable to work, have never worked in the UK, and because they only have pre-settled status, can't access services, and they tend to fall between all the agencies. So that's an area of concern for me. In terms of the legislation itself, if you approach the council and you have accommodation available to you, but you've received a notice from a landlord, then the council owes you a prevention duty. And the prevention duty is basically working with you and potentially your landlord to try and resolve whatever it is that's making your landlord issue you with a notice. Yeah. If that fails, the council then has a relief duty if you are in priority need. So Wilkie mentioned the different categories. The council would then have a duty to accommodate you. Now, at that point, this is where the council would consider local connection, because while a council, if you lived in Dartmoor and you approached Northampton Council, as was, under the prevention duty, they'd have a duty to assist you. So they'd have a duty to try and find you accommodation, alternative accommodation, or to help you stay in your existing accommodation. At the point that you lost the accommodation, they can then make a referral back down to Dartmoor. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's good, that local connection, because we've had some problems here because well, you may know about this, Andy, so like you're in housing. So we often have, as part of the benefits issue, thank you, but didn't mention it, a lot of boroughs now are placing people well out of area to actually secure accommodation. So we've had families sent up to Leicester, etc. And one of the kinks of the local connection would be, for example, in the old Wellingborough borough one. So you might have a London borough refer somebody to Wellingborough, and they're housed and they settle in Wellingborough and all the rest of it. If they become homeless again within the first 2 years, they often become priority. They're expected to go back to the original, say it was the London borough.
Yeah.
So Wellingborough Council built into their policy that to be eligible, you had to live in the borough for 2 years, except if you've been relocated here by another borough, in which case you'd have to be here for 4 years. You know, okay. So you'd have that 2 years that you were under the London borough, and then another 2 years.
And that wasn't challenged.
Sorry?
That wasn't challenged?
No, I think that went straight through the council. It was in the policy book. So that's a good example of the local connection. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. I mean, just very briefly further on local connection, you can't refer to another local authority if the person would be at risk in that other local authority's district. Yeah. So if they've fled violence, for example, or domestic abuse. Yeah.
Violence is an exception to everything. Yeah.
You mentioned 28 days. It's actually 56. Up until April 2018, it was 28 days. Now 56. So if you're at risk of losing your accommodation within the next 56 days, the council may owe you the prevention duty. If you lose it, they then have an obligation, if you're vulnerable or in priority need, to provide you with accommodation for at least 56 days. And during those 56 days, they should be looking to help you find accommodation of your own. At the end of the 56 days, they should then consider whether you're owed the main homelessness duty. Now, the main homelessness duty doesn't mean the council has a duty to rehouse you. It simply means that the council has a duty to provide you with suitable long-term temporary accommodation. And it can bring that duty to an end by offering you social housing or offering you, as Wilkie's already mentioned, a tenancy in the private sector. Although at that stage, the tenancy has to be expected to last for at least 12 months and obviously has to be affordable. So the issue around DHP payments is a bit of an interesting one because the councils have some flexibility about how they use those payments. Generally speaking, they're not meant to be particularly long term. And I believe in West Northants, it's normally 6 months that they apply them for, rather than 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, they're also useful for, well, and for that, for useful people who are subject to the bedroom tax.
Yes, although people subject to the bedroom tax, well, they're not subject to it if they're pensioners.
No, but if they're subject to bedroom tax, you can use DHP as long as you're on the list to be downsized.
Yes, yeah. There was something else that I wanted to come in. You mentioned about you're only homeless if you don't have accommodation available.
Yeah, you've got a right to occupy. Yeah,
your right to occupy. That applies to the whole of the planet. So, you know, if you have a home in Spain and you apply to the council as homeless, then the council can find you not homeless because you've got accommodation in Spain. And then, you know, if you can't afford to get there, then the council will offer to pay for you to get out there. But yes, it has to be available for you to occupy, and safe for you to occupy and affordable. But yes, it's a bit of a minefield. I'm sure there's something else I wanted to raise, but I might just leave it there. Oh, sorry, you mentioned gatekeeping.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's the experience in the councils that make up Northants Council now. But
to say, Andy, it sounds like you're in the West, but I dealt with all 7.
Okay. Well, I don't know whether you dealt with West Northants. There is no, certainly I can tell you there's no gatekeeping in Northampton. The test in terms of providing somebody who's homeless on the day with accommodation is simply reason to believe that they're eligible, reason to believe they're homeless, and reason to believe they're in priority need. You don't have to be satisfied. The satisfied test comes later on when you're looking at main duty and whether you continue to provide temporary accommodation. And in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds, there's case law around this, and the expectation is that...
I'm afraid that's more breach in the observance, than actually doing that. I used to work on the Young Persons Protocol. Absolutely nightmare, Andy. Absolute nightmare, mate.
Well, I'm sorry you say that.
Yeah, sorry. Experience.
In terms of 16 and 17-year-olds, there is a protocol in the West, but there's case law from can't remember the client, but the council was Southwark because I was working there at the time.
Oh yeah.
And as a result of the case law, it was made clear to children's services that the expectation was that if there was a 16 or 17-year-old who was homeless in their district, while there is a responsibility with the housing department and also children's services, the expectation is that children's services would be the primary agency for that. And actually only in exceptional circumstances would the housing department be the responsible department in the council. Now, you know, so children's services haven't always held to that. And certainly in my service, if we have disputes with social services, we will accommodate until we resolve those disputes. Yeah.
Northampton, when you had them, I don't really want to bore the people over the instance that it should work. The Young Persons Protocol doesn't always. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. There was one other thing, and I've forgotten it. If I remember it, I'll come back. Okay. That's okay. If you don't mind.
Those clarifications. It's good. Yeah, it's a real. I mean, that was my particular area. So it's a real bugbear about the young people. but very judgmental. I have to say Northampton was very good sometimes, that they would actually house, because they couldn't believe the decisions Children's Services have made as well. Often you get, just to clarify about the law, if a young person goes to housing, they've got a duty in the first place to house them till they have the arguments with social services, and it should be the same as social services.
Yes.
Sadly, again, you would get the people at the front, and I've had it with housing officers all over and children's services. They've all sent them back and forth. I spent most of my working week trying to argue sense into both parties.
Well, it's a shame you're retired, because if there'd been any examples of that happening in my service, I would have asked you to contact me.
Oh, I would have done. I wasn't very popular. Well, I was popular. I was friendly. What I was saying wasn't always welcome.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
if we come across cases in Northampton, Andy, we'll give you a ring. Okay.
Yes,
no,
please.
quite right. It's good clarification Andy was saying there about because of course people tend to forget that people got second homes, they can forget it. I mean, there's obviously economic considerations as well. If you've got more than a certain amount of money in your bank account, they're going to expect you to carry it out, to look after yourself and that. But people have often overlooked the fact that the travelling community, the migrant community, has got rights as well. And that includes, I mean, people forget that there's such pressures now. Even the boat people are people who live on the canals and that, they're finding the same situations. That's very useful. It's nice to hear that somebody like Andy, hopefully in the departments. And I must say, from the customer or the homeless person going in, it can be a very different and quite frightening experience. Yep. I've certainly gone in with young people, and I've been in with families, housing departments, benefit departments, and people get such short shrift and spoken to so badly. It sounds like Andy's going to be an honourable exception here. I'm sure there are good people all over the place. That, and I've been with them, and you just have to say, actually, under Section 27 or whatever bit of the benefits legislation, isn't it true that? Then you get a completely different response.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, it's that real problem. Somebody says they're homeless. I mean, I think this was particularly true. We have to remember in Northamptonshire, we're a very rural area. So I had a young man who was homeless up in, just the village the other side of Fotheringay. He was supposed to go sign on in Peterborough, but the only bus in the area that will get into Peterborough was the dial-up bus. And if the dial-up bus was busy that day, he couldn't get to sign on. Therefore, he had no visible means of income. And I've had young people, for example, and this happened in Northampton, sadly, Andy, probably before your time. I had a young person who was in one of those care arrangements where they put him up for a couple of years, chucked him out at 18, told him to go down housing. When he went down housing, he had no birth certificate, no income, no bank account, and they refused to house him on the basis they wouldn't be able to claim benefits for him.
When was this?
How
many years ago?
2 years ago.
How many?
2. But I mean, that's a separate matter. It's probably bore all these people. But it's just, you know what I mean? So it's very, very difficult. And I think the approach that, and it's very daunting for young people. And I think, with the rural area, that's very difficult as well, because there always was the expectation that, can you present at the council? And for, particularly young people or whatever with no money or means of getting about, that in itself can be a very real barrier.
Could I bring Sue in at this point? Because Sue and Richard have both been waiting very patiently to come in. So, Sue, if you'd like to unmute and...
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I was going to do was sort of, Wilkie's talked a lot about young people, but I happened to bump into an old friend on Tuesday who I knew when we used to work in Women's Aid. And it was quite shocking to learn that there is no longer a refuge in the North Northants area. So if you are a female with children trying to escape domestic violence, you have literally, you're at the mercy of everything that Wilkie's described, of trying to get accommodation. There's just nowhere for you to go anymore, and that has all the funding for those have gone.
Yeah.
And there's nothing anymore. So that was just something I wanted to sort of mention. The other thing is Wilkie sort of hinted on the fact that I used to work in this area a few years ago. When we worked on the Rough Sleep, I worked on the Rough Sleepers Initiative and the Supporting People programme. And at that point, because there was such a huge amount of money coming from central government into reducing rough sleeping, we had got the numbers down in West Northamptonshire to 6. And we knew them. We knew their name, we knew their address, we knew their dog's name, we knew their dog's vet, we knew everything about sort of those half a dozen. And I was interested when Wilkie said the number now is 83. And that has changed in that period.
Just West Northants.
West Northants, yeah.
Just West Northants, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we, you know, with that amount of money coming in and the support workers that are out on the street every single day, I don't think you're ever going to eliminate street homelessness completely, because you've always got those people who are have just got kicked out and are just street homeless. But they used to be picked up so quickly that we were getting the numbers down to sort of around about 6. So that was the other thing. And the third thing I wanted to mention is in terms of gatekeeping. I supported a man who was becoming street homeless due to mental health issues, where he'd lost his job and had stopped paying the rent due to mental health issues. And we went to Wellingborough Council to apply council housing, and they refused to even assess him. Literally just refused him out of hand to assess. And I went to shelter because I was with him. I went to shelter and got all the legal advice they could give me, and they gave me letters. And the moment I turned up there with those letters to Wellingborough Council, they capitulated and housed him immediately.
Absolutely.
But if there wasn't somebody like myself to advocate for him, he would have been homeless. And I can tell you he would have been dead.
One of the questions I'd got is, are there housing advocacy services in the Wellingborough and other parts of the county? Doesn't the CAB have a contract or something to provide housing advice? Isn't there a legal requirement?
This is something I'll say that I have to say this was about 5 years ago, and we were referred to the fish shop in Wellingborough, which was providing housing advice. And
community legal service, wasn't it?
They were completely colluding with Wellingborough Council's illegal or housing policy. They were colluding with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, we had to go to law for a couple of young people. That service isn't available now either, and certainly not easily accessible. It's a bit like trying to get a doctor's appointment.
There is a housing solicitor who doesn't operate in Wellingborough, but he's available. He lives in Wellingborough. Durgayu Patel. He's a housing advice solicitor. Works in London, I think, or perhaps he's moved closer to home. But I've referred people to him.
That's great, Paul. But you know, like young lad homeless in the back street of Rawlins, England, are they? I mean, it has to be visible. And
yeah, the gentleman that I was supporting, if I hadn't been there, he would have been straight homeless. There was no way he'd dealt with that situation himself.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion, Wilkie, and thanks for your presentation and his contributions. Okay, I've got a bit of an anecdote actually here, because some 40 years ago, I ran something called the Outlook Centre. All remember, I think you two as well, Wilkie. And kind of like
too young, Richard.
Fine. You were just a CSV, wet behind the ears. We know, yeah, right. On the roll-ups, basically. I remember having a young man on my program then. It was 16 to 19 years old. I was looking after them.
Richard, you need to get closer to your mic somehow, because you keep fading in and out.
Is that right? Okay. I'll
try that.
Right. Can you hear me then? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I had one particular guy on the programs who at that point had real problems with his parents, and he became sort of homeless. Anyway, basically, I ended up working in London from 1989 to 2012, 13. Now, about 3 months ago, I got a phone call from somebody saying a gentleman by the initials AP was after somewhere to live. And I worked out immediately who that was. And that guy is now 56. Okay. And he's been creatively completely homeless throughout the whole of that period. So from the age of 17, 18, that young man has never worked, and he's been completely within the system, from going from pillar to post. Basically, I'm a landlord. I'm an evil landlord, but I think I'm a conscientious one. I take people who are homeless, take people who are unemployed. Okay, despite Article 21 being removed, which means that there's no such thing as a law of no fault evictions. I still take people, and I think landlords should be compelled to take people, quite frankly, as well. So I was presented with this same person from 40 years ago, incredible. I got him in a second, who this, without even saying the person's name, actually, who it was, their description.
You're still breaking up, Richard. I don't know why. You need to invest in some proper bloody headphones, because every time you do a Zoom, where have you gone?
There you are. I'm here. Okay. So for me, that was sort of an indictment of what's obviously been going on and not going on locally, that this person is still in the system, as it were, quote marks. Okay. My observation from what Wilkie said is contrasting it with, in a sense, the luxury that I have of working in London for 22 years, where I headed up something called OSW, not ASW. OSW stood for Off the Streets and Into Work, where I ran a program for probably up to sort of 60 or 70 people at a time, which was based upon getting everybody into work. Okay. And the clear problem always was when you got a person into work, because very often they wanted to work, okay, and they had the ability to do so, because there's socioeconomically, generally speaking, the profile of younger people and older people who are homeless very often is that they're very capable. In fact, it's not by accident that the most popular radio station amongst the unemployed in London, amongst the homeless in London, is Classics FM. There is this thing about this myth about people being very, very deprived, not necessarily so. Anyway, so OSW or versions of it were never rolled out nationally, okay, where in fact the compulsion was to get a person into a job and to find inducements to employers to take people on. But where we did get people into work, they found they dropped out very quickly for the very simple reason because the wages they got weren't enough to be able to pay the hostels that they were living in. You know, if you're living in a hostel and you're unemployed, it's paid for by the state, not a problem. Benefits after a while of not messing around, you finally got it. But if you're in work, your employment wouldn't produce enough to be able to sort of stay in the hostel, to be able to stay there and pay for it. Now, I understand now there's no such thing under universal credit laws, whereby you can actually be worse off working than not working. I suspect Wilkie would know to the contrary about that. That it is, that's not necessarily the case. So really, my presentation here on this point is sort of what is being done among 16 to 19. Look, let's break the cycle from early as we possibly can, and get people into jobs and into work, and if possible, provide the benefits, trajectory, so that they remain in work if possible, because that's not been part of what we've been talking about, Wilkie, particularly, and it slightly surprises me.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly this relates to the job that Sue used to do, and you'll know about this, but that's typically one of those things about, again, the young people being very discriminated against. Apart from the fact you don't get proper wages until you're 21, you get this sort of different rate up to 18 and up to 21. If you are working, but you're on a low wage and you find it difficult to rent, and you could do with some assistance, unless it's a change which Andy will tell me about, they actually take, to work out how much help you'll get towards your rent, they work out what your disposable income is. That's the difference between what you'd get on benefits and what you're actually getting from work. Now, when they work that out, because you're under 25 and you get £13 less a week, when they start deducting to see how much disposable income, straight away, you're seen to have £13 more disposable income than somebody over 25. An example, if you were, say you earn £100 a week and you get in under 25, you get 60 quid. You're seen to have £40 disposable income out of the £100 wages. If you're over 25 and you're on the 80 quid a week, you're only seen to have £20 disposable income, so you get more help towards your rent. So young people are really badly discriminated against. Any other group being treated like that.
I mean, this is hideous when you think about it, because this is not a new thing. This is a very, very old thing indeed.
Tony Blair promised to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, Dame Louise Casey, who's been doing this thing about the police and their institutionalised racism and stuff, and God knows what. He used to head up the Rough Sleepers Union. I used to work with Louise Casey, and then we talked about this, making sure that whatever happens, you didn't fall down the benefits trap and be worse off by working ever. And it sounds like it's not been solved at all, right? Which is deplorable.
Andy, you've got your hand up again. Is that a legacy hand, or did you want to come back?
No, I wanted to come back.
Okay,
all right.
Come back. Yeah, please come back.
Okay, just a few points. Okay, so domestic abuse has been mentioned. Historically, domestic abuse was not an automatic priority. Obviously, if you fled domestic abuse and you had children, then the children granted you a priority, and the fact that you fled was confirmation of homelessness. From about, I'm trying to think, I think it's July of last year, if you're fleeing domestic abuse, even as a single person, that is priority. So that's a useful change to the legislation that has been brought in by this current chaotic government.
Does that include any other form of harassment?
No, no. So if you're experiencing, so the domestic abuse, what counts as domestic abuse? It has to be abuse from there's a phrase, something like an associated person or something like that. And there's a definition of what an associated person is. And fundamentally, it kind of goes down to second cousins, or no, first cousins. So, you know, parents, grandparents, children, cousins. Yeah. So it's kind of defined. And if it's beyond that, or is it second cousins? I'd have to look it up. But it's defined. So anything outside of that particular bubble is just violence. Now that might confirm that you're homeless, because it wouldn't be reasonable for you to remain in the property. But it's not an automatic priority. Okay. And for you to be in priority need as a result of violence, the council would have to be satisfied that as a result of that violence, you were more likely to suffer more harm than the ordinary person if homeless. So basically, it would have had to have some kind of effect on your mental health, and quite a significant effect on your mental health. And I will come into this vulnerability thing, because there's some case law around this which is quite unpleasant from my personal point of view. But I think it might be useful if people know it, so that they can have an understanding of just how high the threshold is for a single person to be deemed to be vulnerable. Before I get into that, just a few other things. Revenge evictions were mentioned. So if you complain to your landlord and your landlord then issues you with a Section 21 notice, which is a no-fault eviction. If you've raised issues of disrepair with your landlord and they've failed to address them within 14 days, and you then raise them with the council, and the council issues it's either an emergency improvement notice and let's look. Yes, an emergency improvement notice, or what's the other one? There is another one. Emergency works notice. Your landlord can't issue you with a Section 21 notice for another 6 months. So there is some protection there, but you are risking the fact that if you complain to the council and the council only takes informal action against your landlord, or doesn't take a level of action against them that would protect you, then your landlord can proceed with the Section 21 notice. So there's always a risk.
Sorry, Section 1 is going. It's about, pretty well gone. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Section 21 has been repealed.
When is that? Since when?
Yeah.
I know that.
Right, it just has. It doesn't. It's been repealed.
No. The government went out to consultation around Section 21. But my understanding is that they haven't passed the relevant legislation yet, because we were consulted as a homelessness service around what we thought might be the upshot of that happening. I mean, as it is, a lot of landlords are selling up now because of the rising interest rates and because of their concerns around the potential changes. But actually, if you look at the changes that they're looking to bring in, it's still open for landlords. It still will be open for landlords to basically get people out of their properties quite quickly and fundamentally for no fault. So if the landlord claims that they're selling the property, then there's no defense, for the tenant. There is a caveat, or there's a proposed caveat, that if the landlord evicts a tenant because they claim they're going to sell it, that they can't relet the property within 3 months. But the question there is, who's going to police that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, the landlord's not going to come to the council and say, oops, I've done something naughty. And the councils don't have the resources to go chasing up every time somebody registers a fresh claim or takes on a tenancy or this, that, and the other. So I don't see how it's feasible that can be policed. So I think the changes are toothless in terms of tenants. But like anything with this government, it's about how it's presented rather than the actual content of it. Wilkie mentioned about sort of dormitories for SWEP, the Severe Weather Emergency Protocol. Certainly in West Northants, that's not what we've been using historically. We've used student accommodation from the uni, for example. And also, just for people so they're aware of this, it's not just if the weather gets really, really cold. It has to be, in terms of it being cold, it has to be below zero, forecast to be below zero, I think for 2 or 3 nights running before it gets initiated. But West Northants certainly also ran its SWEP protocols when we had the severe heat waves.
Good.
Yes.
Good.
So it's any form of severe weather. Right. So coming back to this issue about single people being deemed vulnerable or not vulnerable, there's case law around this. There was an individual called Hotak, I think. And again, it was Southwark Council, although I wasn't working for them at this point. And the council found that an individual who had quite severe medical issues, mental health problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder, they deemed that he wasn't vulnerable, and therefore they wouldn't accommodate him. And their argument was that because he could rely on his brother to help him get up in the morning, to make sure he took his medication, to make sure he had something to eat, etc., 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 they deemed that he would not be more likely to suffer harm than the ordinary person if homeless. It was challenged in court, and the council won. So the councils can point to what support somebody has available. So even if they've got, like I said, something like post-traumatic stress disorder and severe mental health problems, if the council can point to support being in place that would support that person while they were street homeless, then they can deem that that person wouldn't be vulnerable. So that's the nature of the case law around homelessness.
It is disgusting.
It is disgusting. And then one final thing, is it Sue mentioned about, I think it was Wellingborough Council refusing to take an application. Councils can refuse to take applications. Applicants can't insist on a homeless application, but they can only refuse with them essentially where someone has previously had a negative decision and their previous application has been closed and there's been no material change in their circumstances. So there's been no material change, and that was kind of to prevent situations where somebody would get a negative decision one day and then present back to the council the next and start a new accommodation responsibility. But other than that, in terms of homelessness, as Wilkie pointed out, you don't have to fill in an application form. Essentially, an application is triggered at the point that a council officer is made aware that somebody has a housing issue. It's as simple as that. And if councils are insisting on people completing application forms before they'll start the ball rolling, then that would be unlawful. Clearly, they obviously have to get information about someone in order to provide them with the right advice. But certainly they cannot insist that somebody completes a paper form or any other form before they start providing them assistance and assessing whether they have a duty.
Wilkie, you got your hand up, and then Sue.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's just well, 2 points there really. Is one is the bit about the gatekeeping. So, for example, the violence one, it was extended to all groups. It was originally meant for people fleeing domestic violence. That got expanded to other groups and is particularly used now with people trying to escape gang violence, whether they've had a member of their family assaulted by nearby people, or house invasions where gangs have broken into their house, etc. Just an example of the gatekeeping there. I think I've been in several case conferences where the definition is, are they escaping violence, are there threats to kill, and are they likely to be carried out? And very frequently we run into issues there with people saying, well, we need police reports, and the very last thing in these circumstances somebody's going to do is be seen to add being a grass to the rest of the problems they're facing. So that's a real issue really there. And I think it is difficult about housing applications. I'm sorry, Andy, you sound like a nice guy with your head screwed on, but my experience has been several times people have, even if they got through the homeless bit, been told we can't do anything with you until you fill the housing application form in. And certainly we've had people turned away from offices when they're presented as homeless for the first time, no previous decisions, and they've been told they have to go home and fill this application in first, or do it online and then come back. It's been so often, because I've been there with them, mate, and you have to stand there and go, as Sue's experience is, not having a pop against you, if it was all like you, we'd probably be getting on fine. But that has been the case. So if I've been there with people, that's the public's experience. And Sue seems to back that up reasonably. That will vary by which officer you get, and particularly in when there were 7 district boroughs, you get quite a different response from each of those different boroughs, and sometimes from whoever you happen to spoke to in that borough.
So did you want to come in?
Yeah, there was a couple of points. Firstly, this case that I was talking about, I mean, literally, we turned up there and they put the phone down. Like Wilkie said, I was with him when this happened. And it was only because I went, I'm sure this isn't legal, and went to shelter. Shelter gave us some legal information. They put it in words, and I went back and handed it to them, and they completely capitulated immediately and housed him. And he is still in that house now, years later, 5 years later. If I hadn't been there, he would have walked away and would have been street homeless, because Wellingborough Council were acting unlawfully. And the second thing I wanted to mention is it's an anecdotal family sort of connection, which shows just how vile the housing situation is at the moment. Now, many of you know my daughter. Richard in particular knows my daughter Kerry. Her partner of 20 years suddenly, out of the blue, completely unexpected, had a total leg amputation. He was a long-distance lorry driver. He lost his job. They were living in a house. They had all the assessments done. The house was not possible to be adapted to meet his new needs, and he was rehoused by the council within 3 months in a 3-bed, beautiful property in Geddington. And that was because, in the eyes of everybody involved, they were worthy.
They were what?
They were worthy of getting that beautiful house, because they were, all of this had happened. It wasn't their fault. There was no blame to be attached to them. It was because they were worthy, and they would not have got that house if they'd been deemed to have had any issues.
It's funny, Sue.
From it, and she wasn't going to turn it down, and I don't think any of us would blame them for not turning that down. But they had a completely different experience of homelessness because of their situation, and I think 99% of homeless people have, and I think that made me feel it's them, but I'm sure you get what I'm saying, don't you?
Yeah. It's funny, Sue, that about 5 minutes ago I put on my notes here, deserving versus undeserving, and I mean this is well known that it comes in where there's discretionary powers. Like, for example, Wilkie, you mentioned about the power to help people with their rent for a period or what have you. I am certain, I mean, and this is that officers will often exercise discretion in favour of somebody if they're considered to be deserving or victims, as opposed to undeserving, i.e. they may have an addiction or mental health problem, or they're smelly, or there's something about the person that means that they might be then discriminated against. So that's something that must also occur within this system. It must do, because that's the way discrimination so often operates. Richard, you've got your hand up and you haven't said anything for a while, but I'm going to start to draw this to a conclusion. So, people who haven't asked a question yet or haven't made a contribution, if you could indicate, so that I can prioritize you against those of us who've spoken more often. So please indicate now if you want to come in. But Richard, you come in now, and then Andy. You need to unmute, Richard.
I have just a very brief observation from being a landlord, that I've had 2 or 3, or probably more than that, phone calls from councils saying this. Wellingborough Council, and before that it was now Northants Council, sort of offering me rent for the first 3 months and a deposit paid as well. But then they say they just drop off. They don't do anything after that at all. Okay. And so there is sort of some sort of weird attempts being made, I think, to provide some elements of support for people who they believe probably subjectively to offer some hope, who present themselves as people who really want to move on in life. I don't know if there are any rules on these things, how these kind of cases are come by, or what sort of accountability is behind any of this, but they struggle very hard to find landlords who will take people. That's the problem. It's the attitude of private landlords, which is terrible. Really, it should be vastly more social housing, and we know that, and an easy route through the stuff that Wilkie has been talking about. Okay, that's just my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Andy. Andy, do you want to come back?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah.
Okay, a couple of things. Right, I don't deny that some local authorities act unlawfully when it comes to their responsibilities under the homeless legislation. I could name many local councils which are awful. Yeah, I would be very concerned if there was anyone in my service that was acting unlawfully, and if it was brought to my attention, I would deal with it. Having said that, obviously we have individuals, they're human beings, they're making decisions. We can't review every single decision that they make. But if people make complaints and that suggests that there are issues around particular officers, then they will be addressed if there's any signs of discrimination. Coming back to the example that Sue gave about the lorry driver who unfortunately lost his leg, it's likely you don't have to be physically homeless to be deemed to be homeless. That might sound a bit contradictory. But if the accommodation that you have access to is unaffordable or is unsuitable, and I would suggest, you mentioned that the property couldn't be adapted, then you are technically homeless and the council should deal with you as such, which might explain how they got rehoused so quickly. I mean, there is the element within the legislation of the deserving and the undeserving poor, or certainly the undeserving intentionally homeless. The problem that we have, which has been alluded to by the earlier speaker, is that certainly a lot of the households we deal with are quite chaotic. They'll have county court judgments against them, or IVAs or whatever, and we have to declare those to landlords. Landlords will not rent properties to people who have got bad credit ratings. Yeah, and that's part of the problem. If we've got somebody who's intentionally homeless, and we're trying to find them alternative accommodation before we have to make that decision and withdraw any temporary accommodation we're providing, we're trying to work with landlords who aren't forced to take our applicants on. They can choose not to. And the other thing is that while there was a court case or a ruling several years ago, which means that it's actually illegal for landlords to refuse someone simply because they're on benefits. What landlords will do is they'll put in things around references and this, that, and the other, which fundamentally means that it's impossible for anyone on benefits to take the property, or they'll have a situation where their landlord insurance will be invalid if they have someone on benefits. So until the government outlaws landlord insurance, which refuses particular categories of prospective tenants, that the cover won't include them, then you'll always have this issue about how do we get people into the private sector, even despite whatever incentives we can give landlords and whatever. And there was one other thing, but I don't want to hog the time because I'm conscious that it's 22 minutes.
Andy, given your experience in Northampton, I've got a question about refugees, because
yes,
I mean, we have read about, say, for example, Afghani refugees who've been housed currently in accommodation in Northampton, hotels and what have you, who are being told they've got to leave and find accommodation. And presumably they're then counted as homeless because they're being told they've got to leave their temporary accommodation. What's happening to them now?
Okay, so the government did provide a lot of money. Certainly in West Northants, there was a lot of work done with the Afghan refugees who were in the bridging hotels in the area. So it wasn't just Northampton, there was others. And most of them have actually been rehoused into private sector accommodation. A small number would have approached the council because they had to leave their bridging hotels at the end of August. Now, we were doing some work with those because even if you're a refugee, you're not automatically in priority need. So many of the Afghan refugees were single men, and unless they were vulnerable because they had mental health issues or whatever, there wouldn't be a duty to accommodate them under the HRA, the Homelessness Reduction Act. But as far as I'm aware, we've resolved all of the housing issues for those individuals.
Is that the case in other parts of the county where the
not necessarily? I couldn't tell you what's happened in the north or whatever that happened in other parts of the country. But yes, I mean, because initially they were told that they would get 2 offers of permanent accommodation organised by the Home Office, and if they refused them, then they would get kicked out. And then at that point, they could approach any local council. They were then told it was only going to be 1, and then very rapidly after that, they were then told, that's it, we're cutting off all support as of the end of August. That all happened in very quick succession this year. So yeah, it was typical government action, panic, basically, to deal with an issue, because they've been in these hotels for over 2 years. It's just ridiculous. Families with children.
And they've done nothing to help find them permanent accommodation.
No, but that, like I said, that has been resolved by local authorities getting involved. Fundamentally. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for that. Is there Wilkie? You want to come back? Yeah. Great. Perhaps Wilkie, you could bring this to a conclusion, if sense. Make any comments, obviously, you want to in response to what people have said, but could you perhaps draw it to a conclusion so that we can?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. We didn't think it would go on this long, did we, Paul? It's brilliant. Everybody's contribution. I think just a little point to go up there. Social housing do also apply affordability criteria. Spire Homes, which runs East Northants, I suppose it's into Kettering and Corby now, used to get a red flag on your application simply for being on benefits. And I've had young people turn down for social housing because they said they couldn't afford to live it on the rate the government pays them if they're not working. So there you go. That's interesting. I think it's an issue we should all take. We can see that when you're dealing with homelessness, it's really important that people have got access to good quality, independent advice.
Yes.
They know where to get that. That needs to be available in easily fetched localities, as they say. in Wellingborough, for example, was good, but was run by the councils. You had those issues of collusion sometimes. There used to be independent people who would get contracts off the council, like what's the name, Accommodation Concern in Kettering. Though what reports they give to me is when they actually were being very active challenging the council, then the contract went elsewhere. So there is the problem, there is the law, there is highly aggressive gatekeeping by different sectors, housing, social services, etc. Social housing do their own gatekeeping, of course, because they want to keep their status as quiet as possible, which is quite understandable. But it's a meaningful thing. I mean, I think it's very important to remember that it is good. It's being discussed at the moment. People who may remember at, was it George Young, the Tory minister, once said of the homeless, oh yes, they're the ones you trip over on the way to the opera. But it's important, I think, when we get into this area, because homelessness can happen to anybody any day. You know, you can just have something happen in your life. You know, you can't get out of bed, you don't go to work, you lose your house because you haven't paid the rent, because you're depressed because you haven't been to work. And then if you get to housing, of course, they could deem you intentionally homeless because you haven't paid your rent. You know what I mean? So it's something that we really need to address, because it could happen to anybody tomorrow. And it's really such a shame to see after the pandemic, when people coming in, Sue said about we took the rough sleepers off the street through various different schemes, and they're reappearing now. And certainly often they will come into this, what Paul alluded to, the undeserving. But where people are homeless or don't have secure accommodation and that fans out across society as a whole, I think, and makes everybody anxious and makes everybody competitive for what is available out there. And perhaps competitiveness is the last thing we need to be involved in the housing markets. We should be looking to house first, house fair. We didn't get time to go into foreign models. I mean, that's probably for another day, but you'll see that there's a lot less. It's tied up perhaps a bit with our feudal history, particularly in England, that an Englishman's home is his castle, is often said. But that's not the case abroad. Lots of people are quite happy to live in long-term rented accommodation. You know, people regard that in those cases as an investment in property rather than seeking to get money off directly back off. You know, the houses now. It's a long-term investment. So we do need, there's cultural issues we need to address as well. You need to unmute, Paul. Don't often say that. Paul, we can't hear you. Again, we don't often say that.
I muted myself, which is most unusual, as you say, Wilkie, for me to be quiet. Thank you very much, Wilkie, for presenting this very complex topic, and thank you also, Andy, for bringing in also your perspective as a homelessness housing professional, if you like, working for Northampton Borough Council, and Sue for your historic involvement in these issues as well, and Richard bringing in part at least, a landlord perspective, or a progressive, is there such a thing, progressive landlord perspective? But so we you know, these questions are really very important. The whole question of homelessness, of course, relates back ultimately to lack of accommodation and a lack of housing, a lack of suitable flats and what have you at affordable rents, and for a benefit system which is pathetic in helping and supporting people. So all these things come together to those political questions: housing, benefits, and how that all those systems interrelate. But thank you very much and I'm sure people found this a really useful contribution to their understanding of the issues. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now, and but the meeting will continue. So just hold on a second.